Commander Elias Rourke lowered his binoculars and frowned at the lone figure stretched out along the far ridge, half swallowed by rock and scrub. One woman sniper, 60 pounds of gear, a single long rifle, facing a ring of insurgents dug into the dark timberline above his trap patrol. On the operations board back at base, the math had looked simple: 8 special operators, 1 Overwatch shooter, a small hostile element with light weapons. In the real valley, under the thin mountain air and the thunder of machine gun bursts, that briefing felt like a bad joke. The enemy had belt-fed guns, more rifles than expected, in better positions than any satellite photo had hinted. White sparks from impact stitched the dirt around his men's cover, and the air carried that choking mix of cordite, dust, and the sharp edge of someone about to die. Rourke's earpiece crackled with controlled voices barking for smoke, for angles, for something they could not name, a way out. His gaze slid back to the sniper on the ridge, barely visible except for the glint of glass when the sun caught her scope. Staff Sergeant Myra Vale. Call sign Whisper. 29 years old, mountain unit, record on paper that looked nearly impossible, and a face that, to his mind, did not belong in the middle of this firefight. He caught himself thinking it and shoved the thought down, but Byers clung like grit between his teeth. One woman against a whole ridgeline of guns. Command had insisted she attach to his team. Asset of special value. Trust her, the colonel had said. Right now, pinned in a shallow wash with tree bark exploding around his man, trust felt expensive. And yet, as Rourke lifted his binoculars again, he watched the quiet shape on the ridge adjust by inches, like the land itself breathing in, and a small part of him hoped he was wrong about her. Myra had felt Rourke's doubt long before this valley. She had seen it in the way he skimmed over her name during briefings, in the quick glance at her uniform, the pause when he reached the word marksman on the roster and his mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. She didn't blame him for having an old frame of reference. Men like Rourke had built careers in units where every face on the team looked roughly the same, talked the same, measured strength the same way. She had come up in a different life, where strength was steady hands in a blizzard, lungs trained by thin air, and the stubborn refusal to look away from a target when everyone else thought the wind made the shot impossible. Long before she held an issued rifle, Myra had held an old hunting piece across the shoulders of her Uncle Jonah, the man who raised her after her parents died in a backcountry car wreck. Jonah Vale had been a sniper in a conflict no one wanted to remember, then a quiet game warden in the Colorado high country. He walked with a limp, moved slow in town, and spoke so little that strangers often assumed he was simple. The mountains knew better. In deep winter, when tourists fled and the wind carved knives across the ridges, Jonah took his niece out into the snow until her eyelashes froze and her fingers ached under gloves. Breathe with the hills, Myra, he'd tell her, voice low and even. They don't care who you are, just whether you listen. He carved small lessons into their days. How to read distant movement by the way a single tree branch twitched. How to feel wind shifts against your cheek instead of trusting a cheap plastic gauge. How to decide when not to pull a trigger even when you could, because the shot would cost more than it saved. Those lessons wrapped themselves around Myra's bones. Their house sat at the edge of a narrow valley, more wood and metal patchwork than anything pretty. Inside, paper manuals on ballistics lay beside dog-eared novels and maps tracing canyons like old scars across the mountains. When other kids slept in on weekends, Myra was already outside, lying prone in crusted snow, sighting in on a steel plate Jonah had wired to a pine trunk 800 meters away. He never praised her for hitting center. He only raised an eyebrow when she missed and made her explain why she thought the bullet had gone wide. If you can explain your miss, you can fix it. If you just curse and fire again, you're guessing. Guessing gets people killed, he'd say. By 15, she could call wind drift off the way snow crystals moved in a gust. By 17, she could track a wounded elk through old tracks and broken lichen when any normal hunter would have given up. And by 18, on the day she enlisted, Jonah handed her his own battered logbook, pages full of angles and ranges and small notes no one else could decode. These numbers kept my friends alive, he told her, weathered hand lingering on the cover. What you carry is not the rifle. It's the responsibility. Remember that when someone who outranks you but knows less about this wants to use you like a mascot. Training found her ready in ways instructors hated and admired at the same time. At basic, she listened more than she spoke, kept her bunk tight, and treated every range day like church. While other recruits joked between firing iterations, Myra watched flags, heat shimmer, the way dust moved beyond the berms. Drill sergeants called her Mouse for the first 2 weeks, assuming quiet meant timid. That stopped the morning they pushed the marksman test to the far limit, wind gusting hard enough to topple lightweight stands. Myra shot last that day. Her grouping on the far silhouettes was so tight the range officer walked down to check the targets by hand. "You've done this before," he said slowly as she stood at ease, sweat cooling on her neck. "Yes, Sergeant, but the mountains don't grade as hard as you do," she answered, deadpan. He laughed once and looked at her file again that night. From there, every assessment added another line in red ink. Exceptional field sense, calculates faster than instrument readouts, unusual calm under pressure. She moved on to advanced marksmanship school and then to the long, brutal sniper course. There, away from the basic crowd, her quiet competence stood out even more. She slept little, studied ballistics tables until numbers blurred, and treated ghillie suit construction as craft instead of checklist. Instructors tried to break her composure with sleep deprivation and stress drills. Under night flays and shouted commands, her heartbeat slowed instead of racing. When pressed, she said only, "Weather is worse than this," and went back to her calculations. Her evaluations did not stop the questions that came later. In real units, with real commanders, Myra met the same pattern again and again. A nod at her records, a tight smile, then assignments that kept her at the edge of operations instead of the center. She provided overwatch on convoys that never drew fire. She watched A-field perimeters while others went after the high-value targets. No one said the quiet part out loud, that they would rather risk missing out on what she could do than risk having to trust her with lives in a chaotic firefight. Some of the younger operators respected her because she had fixed their shooting in an afternoon without making them feel foolish. Others respected her because rumors traveled faster than official memos. Stories of a training exercise where she'd hit 4 steel plates hidden in brush faster than the shiniest graduate from an all-male class. But the gatekeepers of missions, the commanders who signed plans and carried responsibility on their shoulders, often looked at her and saw a problem created by paperwork somewhere far away. Elias Rourke was not cruel about it. He was simply tired, proud, and shaped by 20 years of doing things one way. He had fought in cities, deserts, and scrubland valleys where every rooftop might hide a shooter and every radio call carried stakes. He had lost 2 friends to bad intel and 1 to an impulsive captain who tried something new in a place where new meant untested and dangerous. For him, trust was not abstract. He trusted what he knew. Big men who could run for days. Operators whose nerves and records he had watched for years. When the division commander told him, "You're getting Vale on this rotation. She's special. Make room," he swallowed his objections, signed the paperwork, and told himself he would use her within safe bounds. Overwatch, perimeter, counter-sniper duties from distance. On the tarmac before their first joint mission, he had extended a hand. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "you're with us now. We'll put your skills to work." She had taken his hand with the same composed expression she wore in all her photos, eyes scanning the horizon even during introductions. "Yes, sir. My job is to give you options. I'll be where you need me." The sentence was perfect, polite, impossible to argue with. Still, when he turned away, he was already reshaping the mission plan in his head to keep her where she could do the least harm if she wasn't everything her file claimed. The valley they were now trapped in had looked, on paper, like the right place to test everything. Operation Ridge Lantern. Neutralize a meeting of insurgent coordinators using this mountain fold as their temporary conference room. Satellite shots showed a cluster of abandoned stone huts near stream, a winding path in, no obvious fortifications. The human report suggested 8 or 10 fighters, mostly small arms. The planner's temptation was clear. Quick strike, in and out, almost textbook. Myra had sat in the back during the briefing, eyes tracking from projected map to printed photos, mentally overlaying terrain. She knew mountains. This landscape, though foreign, resonated with the slopes she'd grown up on. The hut sat in a bowl, timber pressing close on two sides. Above them, ridgelines folded back on themselves in layers that looked like nothing from space but, on the ground, would offer concealment for days. The main path in was narrow and exposed. The side draws were steeper, but they offered approaches less obvious than the one Intel had labeled in bright color. "Sir," she had said once the room started to empty, "if they know this meeting might draw attention, they'll study these maps too. The main path will be watched. The trees here, on this northern lip, give perfect firing lanes into your approach. If I take position up here instead," she moved a gloved finger to a different ridge, "I can see both flanks, the back of the huts, and the tree line you'll have to cross. It'll be a hard climb, but it gives us more insurance." Rourke had listened without interrupting, jaw working slightly. He could see her angles made sense. He could also feel his own instinct pushing back. He had not planned for a sniper far forward, balancing on a knife edge of rock with no easy way out if things soured. "We're not rewriting the plan 2 hours before step-off," he answered. "You'll take overwatch from this knoll. It's farther, but safe, and you'll still see the compound." She did not argue, only nodded and said, "Understood, sir." Yet when she left the tent, she unfolded the terrain in her mind again and again. The knoll he had chosen had clear sight lines to the huts, yes, but cliffs and outcroppings obscured the very tree line that made her shoulders prickle. They had underestimated enemy numbers before. They might be doing it again. She double-checked her gear that night with a quiet urgency that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the bad feeling riders get from a horse that shies at shadows only it can sense. Dawn came thin and cold. The team moved in 2 bounding elements, boots barely whispering on the narrow path. Rourke took point, senses tuned to small sounds, loose gravel, wind and dry leaves, the distant rush of water below the ridge. Myra peeled off early, angling toward her assigned knoll. The climb bit into her thighs, but her breathing stayed measured. She moved like she had since childhood, body length low, weight distributed, each handhold and step chosen. At the top, she built herself into the earth, mat, bipod, rifle, radio, spotoscope. No movement wasted, nothing left to chance. Through her glass, the huts on the valley floor sharpened into hard lines. Smoke drifted from one chimney. Men moved, small figures, weapons slung, unaware that someone a kilometer away was picking out their habits and postures. On its own, that sight might have reassured another shooter. But Myra did not just look at the circle of stone. She swept slowly across the edges. The northern tree line, the slope to the west, the crest beyond. There, a flick of light that didn't match the sun's angle. A cluster of rocks with shadows too regular. A pattern in the brush that said, human hands were here. Her uncle's voice rose in memory. "Don't trust the obvious. Predators guard what matters with what doesn't." "Alpha, whisper," she murmured into the radio, keeping her voice low by habit even though sound carried only through encrypted signal. "I have multiple heat signatures in the northern trees. At least 6, possibly more. Elevation slightly above your intended approach. Recommend shifting axis or increasing distance." Static hissed for a beat, then Rourke's reply came back, flat with tension. "Copy, whisper. We see nothing from our side. We on timeline. Keep eyes on. Call targets if they move." He did not add what he was thinking. "We cannot deviate now, not based on a hunch and some shapes in the dark." The operation clock was ticking. A drone orbit would not last forever. Higher command would not patiently wait while one staff sergeant argued about trees. As the team advanced, Myra watched their small figures through her scope, dark shapes against the lighter rock, making textbook use of cover, leapfrogging from boulder to boulder. To their right, the hut stayed quiet. To their left, the tree line stayed still in the way that made the muscles in her neck tighten. One insurgent shifted just enough to scratch his cheek, and his barrel tipped, catching a strip of light. That was all she needed. There were not 6 fighters in there. There were 12, 2 with machine guns, heavier belts feeding into their weapons. One with a radio, several with scopes, watching the same ground Rourke's team was crossing. They were letting the patrol move, letting them feel secure in their own drills, waiting for the moment of maximum vulnerability, midway between the path's last bend and the hut's first cover, where rock fell away on three sides and the only defense was to go forward faster than bullets could chew up the ground. The first shot fired from the trees before Myra could warn them a second time. A heavy round smacked the rock inches from one operator's shoulder, showering him with shards. A half-second later, the entire tree line lit up with muzzle flashes. Tracer fire carved bright lines through the air, forcing the patrol to drop flat behind whatever shallow depressions they could find. Dirt leapt, stones splintered, and the air filled with a hard, flat crack of overlapping rifles. "Contact! North tree line!" Someone shouted, voice barely controlled. "We're in a kill box. Multiple weapons. High ground." Rourke's own call came sharper, edged with anger at himself as much as the situation. "All teams, break contact, smoke out, find hard cover." But there was no hard cover, only low rocks and thin shrubs, poor protection against those angles. The huts they had meant to assault now sat between them and any retreat path that wasn't a straight run through open ground. It was what Myra had feared, a bowl, carefully prepared, waiting for prey. "Whisper, where are they?" Rourke demanded over the radio, breath ragged as he crawled sideways, hauling one of his men by the back of his plate carrier. Numbers and positions. She could hear rounds zipping overhead even up on her ridge, distant but real. 12 confirmed, she replied, fingers adjusting dials without conscious thought. 2 heavy guns, one on each flank. Radio man center. Their elevation is above you. If you stay, they'll walk fire into your cover. I need to move. Rourke swore under his breath, eyes scanning the slope above him and seeing nothing but leaves and shadow. Negative on movement. Whisper. I need eyes, not a ghost. Stay put and support as able. On another day, at another time, Myra might have obeyed. On this slope, with these patterns and her gut saying, trap, obedience would be a betrayal of every lesson Jonah had carved into her ribs. Orders mattered. So did results. With each passing second, the enemy's fire grew more disciplined, stitching closer to helmet edges, chipping away at the thin safety the team had carved out. Myra exhaled slowly, made her choice, and shifted her rifle off its rest. Understood on needing eyes, she answered, voice level. I can't give you what you need from this angle. I'm relocating. Rourke's response came fast and harsh. Negative. Whisper. Hold position. That's an order. She did not reply. The radio clicked once, acknowledgement without further argument, and then she was moving, rolling to her feet in a single smooth motion. She knew exactly where she had to be, on the ridge she had pointed to in the briefing. Getting there meant dropping off the safe knoll and cutting across a narrow ledge no one had planned for. Rock crumbled under her boots as she descended, hugging the cliff face, fingers finding cracks fueled by muscle memory and stubborn focus. She didn't think about what would happen if a stone gave way. She thought only in sequences. 3 seconds to this shelf, 2 to cross, 5 to climb to that outcrop that overlooked the tree line from the side instead of head-on. The world narrowed to the scrape of her gloves and the pounding of distant weapons. Below, men called to each other in a language she didn't know, but panic sounded the same in any tongue. She heard one of her team's machine guns start up, its rhythm uneven, then pause. Jam, she thought distantly. They don't have time for that. Her lungs burned by the time she reached the new ridge, but her hand stayed steady as she flattened herself behind a jag of stone and swung her pack around to set up again. Rifle. Bipod. Scope at 10 power. Quick ranging with old-fashioned eye and reticle instead of electronic aids. She had done this 1,000 times on targets that never shot back. Now, the equation had teeth. From this angle, the tree line that had been just a wall from her previous perch broke into layers. She saw the machine gun nests dug low behind rotting logs, muzzle ends peeking out. She saw the radio man crouched slightly higher, headset wire trailing, one hand on a handset, the other gesturing as he directed fire. She saw 2 marksmen in slightly lighter clothing, rifles resting on branches, scanning for any head that popped above the rocks below. Her team's position lay exposed beneath them, a scattering of bodies pressed into depressions so shallow she could see boot soles and the edges of helmets. They had no more than minutes before luck ran dry. Her first shot, she knew, had to cut what held the enemy together. She tracked the radio man, watched the way others glanced toward him between bursts, waiting for his signals. Distance, 532 meters. Crosswind slanting right, gusty but predictable enough if you knew how to feel its rhythm. She let her cheeks settle against the stock, felt the rifle become an extension of her breath. For a heartbeat, memories overlapped. The smell of pine sap and cold metal in Colorado, Jonah's calm presence at her shoulder, a distant elk unaware of its danger. Then it was only this valley again. This man, this choice. She fired. The shot cracked, rolled back across the ridge, and a heartbeat later the radio man folded sideways as if strings had been cut. His handset flew, tumbling down the slope. For a second, nothing changed. Then the pattern of enemy fire fractured. One machine gunner kept going, but at a slightly higher arc. The other hesitated, raising his head to see why his orders had stopped. Myra was already shifting her aim. Second shot, the hesitant gunner. His barrel dipped, his body slumped forward, and his weapon's chatter died mid-burst. On the valley floor, one of Rourke's trapped operators risked a quick glance up. He didn't know where she was, but he knew something had changed. Alpha, adjust right. Myra murmured into the radio between shots. Left flank gun is down. Right gun still active. Stay low until I say move. Rourke didn't argue this time. Her round had spoken louder than any briefing. Copy, he replied. And this time there was no edge, only a clipped urgency. We're holding. Do what you can. It was all the permission she needed. Her third and fourth shots came in a tight pair. She took the second machine gunner first, timing the shot between two of his bursts so the sound of her rifle blended with his own weapon. He jerked back, tumbling down from his nest. She swung to the nearest marksman, who had begun scanning frantically, trying to locate the source of the invisible punishment. He shifted at the wrong moment. The bullet took him cleanly. Panic rippled through the remaining fighters. Without heavy guns and clear orders, they fired in short, wild bursts, chewing up trees and air instead of rock where the team lay. From below, Rourke watched the change with the grim awe of a man who had seen fights tilt in seconds but never in quite this way. One moment, his men were being hammered. The next, the enemy's cohesion fell apart as if some unseen hand had reached into their lines and plucked out key pieces. He knew shooters capable of brilliant shots in training. He had seen good snipers steady under pressure. But this was different. The pace, the precision, the immediate impact on enemy behavior. It rearranged his sense of what one person with a rifle could do. She moved, he thought, not as a complaint now, but as a dawning understanding. And if she hadn't, we'd be dead. Myra kept working. With heavy guns neutralized, she moved systematically through the remaining threats, prioritizing those who threatened her team's escape paths. Two fighters tried to circle down the slope, hoping to flank the trap patrol. She tracked their progress through gaps in the trees, waiting until their silhouettes overlapped just enough. One shot, two bodies falling, momentum carrying them into each other. Another insurgent, steadier than the rest, chose higher ground, maybe hoping to find the angle she had taken. He never made it to his chosen perch. Her round met him as he rose above cover, knocking him backward so his rifle skittered away. The last three fighters broke. One threw his weapon down and ran downslope toward the huts, perhaps hoping to disappear into stone. The other two bolted sideways along the ridge, desperate to escape the killing ground. Flight made them easy marks. Myra breathed, fired, shifted, fired again. The valley swallowed each sound and gave back the same answer. And then, as quickly as it had exploded, the storm of gunfire ebbed. The air still quivered with echoes, but no new rounds chewed the earth near Rourke's men. Smoke from their own grenades drifted in gray sheets, and in that veil, something like silence returned, broken only by gasping breaths and the drip of loosened pebbles. Alpha, whisper, Myra said, voice low but steady. Tree line is clear. 12 down. You're free to move. Recommend you shift west and use the dry wash for cover to the huts. Your window is small before they realize the outer ring is gone. Rourke forced himself to inhale deeply, grounding his shaking muscles. Copy, whisper, he replied. You heard her, boys. Up and move. We're not dying in a ditch today. As the team relocated, using the path she indicated, Myra stayed on the ridge, scanning for new threats. Inside the huts, activity spiked. Men who had been meeting in relative calm now scrambled, dragging crates, shouting, trying to understand why their protective ring had vanished. In the confusion, the rest of the mission unfolded almost like the clean diagrams in a briefing binder. Rourke's team breached, cleared, detained where possible, neutralized when necessary. Myra picked off 2 more gunmen who tried to flee out the back. Within minutes, the primary targets lay in custody or incapacitated. The explosives expert set charges on remaining weapon caches. When the dust settled, the valley that had almost become a grave turned into a catalog of hard evidence and silenced guns. Only once the extraction birds thumped overhead did Myra allow herself a small pause. Her shoulder ached from the recoil she had ridden through 12 shots in rapid succession. Her cheek was tender where Stock had pressed bone. But her mind stayed clear. No cheering, no private gloating, just a quiet inventory. Shots made, shots withheld, lives saved against lives taken. She packed her gear in careful sequence and began the climb down toward the pickup zone, muscles trembling with delayed exhaustion that felt cleaner than any gym burn. On the flight back, the team sat packed on the benches along the sides of the helicopter, helmets loose, faces streaked with dust and gun oil. Rourke faced them, one hand wrapped around a webbing strap. Across from him, Myra sat slightly apart, rifle case braced between her knees, eyes closed as if sleeping. The others glanced at her in small, quick ways that carried something new, respect so fresh it was still tinged with disbelief. Rourke watched her for a long time, the thump of rotors masking the quiet shift that was happening inside his own head. When they landed and the roar of the blades faded, he called her aside near the edge of the landing pad. The sun was lower now, painting the tarmac in long shadows. For a moment, he didn't speak. He had apologized before in his career, but usually for tactical errors or harsh words, never for the particular mix of doubt and protection he directed at someone like her. Finally, he cleared his throat. Staff Sergeant Vale, he said, defaulting to formality because the other option, using her call sign with a warmth the others now did, felt like something he hadn't yet earned. Sir, she replied, posture straight, expression unreadable. A smear of dust cut across one cheek, and a faint bruise was forming where the rifle stock had kissed her collarbone all day. I gave you an order up there, he began slowly. You ignored it. Her jaw tightened by a hair's breadth. Yes, sir. He let the admission hang for a second, then shook his head slightly. And if you had obeyed, I would be writing letters home right now instead of standing here. You saw something I didn't. You trusted what you knew, not what I thought I knew. 12 hostiles, all neutralized in the span of, what? 3, 4 minutes. She didn't answer. Numbers weren't the point, and she never counted like that. He went on anyway. I have led a lot of teams. I have seen good shooters. I have seen lucky shots that men brag about for years. What I watched today was different. I misjudged you, not your file. You. That's on me. He exhaled, some of his stiffness bleeding out with the breath. From now on, when you say the terrain is lying to us, I'll listen. Her shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. She had not done it for this, for his approval, but the acknowledgement landed somewhere deep where old, quiet frustrations had piled up. Thank you, sir, she said simply. I don't need special treatment. Just a place where what I know can help. He nodded once. You've got it. Next mission, we plan your position first, not last. The after-action review in the next days was more formal, but carried the same undercurrent. Analysts pored over her helmet cam footage and rifle data, mapping each shot's angle and timing. A dry voice from the intel section noted, her movement to an unplanned overwatch point increased survivability of the assault team by an estimated 70%. A training officer said quietly, we don't teach that. Not like this. We teach them where to lie and what to shoot. She saw what the map didn't show. The report that went up through the chain was full of doctrine terms: initiative, battlefield shaping, precision fires. Between the lines, though, it said something harder to quantify. This is what it looks like when experience, instinct, and courage align in one person who refuses to be boxed by someone else's limits. Myra didn't read the report. She heard about it in pieces, comments from other units, a nod from a colonel who usually never looked toward enlisted ranks. What she cared about more was the subtle shift in everyday work. Rourke now paused during planning sessions and asked, "Vale, what does your gut say about this ridge?" Without irony. Younger officers watched her not as an anomaly to manage, but as a resource to learn from. Operators who had once joked about babysitting the sniper now requested her overwatch on their riskier patrols. The questions she fielded changed. 2. Less, can you really hit that far? More, how do you decide which target matters most? She answered with the same patience her uncle had used on her. It's not about distance, she'd say. It's about what happens if you miss. We're not here to make impressive shots. We're here to make shots that change what the enemy can do. Months turned into a year. More missions followed. Some loud and messy, some quiet and over in one perfect, silent engagement at dawn. She never repeated the exact shape of that valley fight, but echoes of it colored everything. The willingness to move when the safe position no longer served. The refusal to let someone else's underestimation trap her into passivity. When evaluation boards met again, they could no longer pretend she was just an interesting case. Promotions came. So did offers, transfer to training commands, advisory roles, places where her experience could ripple out beyond her own trigger finger. At first, she resisted the idea of leaving field work entirely. She told herself she wasn't ready to become the person behind the whiteboard instead of under the camo net. Rourke, now moved up and overseeing multiple teams, sat with her one evening in the dim light of the operations tent. They shared coffee that had long since ceased to taste like anything but burnt beans and fatigue. "You don't have to take it," he said after she slid the assignment packet back across the table. "You're still hell on a rifle. There are commanders who will fight to keep you on their manifests." She stared at the folder, at the neat lines designating her as a future instructor at the Joint Sniper School. "I don't want to stop doing the thing I'm good at," she admitted. "Fieldwork still makes sense to me. The math is clean. See threat, solve problem." He smiled faintly. "You think teaching doesn't feel real?" He shook his head. "I used to say the same. But look at it another way. Right now, your reach is the distance your bullet can travel. In that classroom, your reach is everyone you train. The math changes. More lives, Myra, saved by people who have never even heard your name." She didn't answer that night. She walked instead, out onto the quiet perimeter road, stars sharp overhead. In the darkness, memories surfaced again. Jonah's hand on his old logbook, the way he had looked when he gave it to her, knowing he was handing on not just techniques but an ethic. He had spent years in a cabin so that one kid could learn the difference between reckless bravado and careful courage. She, in turn, had taken that investment into a world of radios and drones and briefings. Maybe the next turn of the wheel was hers to make. She accepted the assignment. The school they sent her to was tucked away near a windswept training range, long lines of Tyro pits stretching out under a sky that changed moods by the hour. Her job title was dry, lead precision fires instructor, but the reality was far from boring. Recruits arrived full of stories they had heard, some even mentioning that woman sniper from the mountains without realizing they were talking to her. She let the myths float. In the classroom, she was not a legend. She was a person who erased numbers on the board and made students recalculate when drift until their answers matched reality. On the range, she walked behind lines of prone shooters, correcting cheek welds, breathing, trigger squeeze. She watched the ones who took correction as insult and the ones who treated it as treasure. She paid special attention to those who were underestimated for reasons that had nothing to do with skill: slight bodies, quiet voices, accents that didn't fit the usual mold. She did not coddle them. She held them to the same standards, sometimes harder. But when she saw the same flare of quiet stubbornness she had once carried, She took them aside after hours. "You can't control what they think when they first see you," she'd say. "You can control what they think after they watch you work." Every now and then, between cycles, Rourke dropped by the school as a guest speaker. He stood at the front of the classroom in his new ranks insignia and told stories that didn't make it into the glossy recruiting brochures. Stories of plans that went wrong, of missions salvaged by someone who saw something no one else did. He never mentioned names until the very end. Then he would nod toward Myra, who usually sat in the back, arms folded. "The most dangerous habit you can carry into a fight is arrogance," he'd tell the room. "I had it. I thought I knew where value came from in a team. Then one staff sergeant from the mountains taught me otherwise by saving my life and the lives of my men while ignoring my bad order. You're here to learn how to shoot. Learn also when to listen to those who see more than you can from where you're standing." The young snipers would turn their heads toward her then, some with shock, others with newfound understanding. Myra always felt a flush of discomfort at the attention, but she didn't deflect it. The story was no longer about her. It was about what they might do someday, when a map lied, when someone in charge doubted their read of a ridge. Years later, when her hair had silver threaded through dark and the logbook from Jonah lay behind her desk in a place of quiet honor, new instructors came to replace her on the line. She moved into a role that seemed, on paper, even further from the cool touch of a rifle stock, writing doctrine, shaping how the entire force thought about snipers, about fieldcraft, about the value of listening sideways to those who weren't standing in the usual spots at the table. She never let the language grow too abstract. Every paragraph that mentioned flexible positioning carried a ghost image in her head of that narrow ledge, that ridge, that valley floor where Rourke's team had almost died. Every section about distributed decision-making owed its phrasing to the day she decided a bad order could not be obeyed. There were no statues of her anywhere. No public ceremonies with cameras flashing. On graduation days, she sat at the edge of the crowd and watched new snipers receive patches, some of them women, some of them men, some of them from corners of the country where snow never fell, and the idea of watching wind in the way she did still felt magical. She watched them exchange grips with their instructors, watched their families beam. In the mess hall later, she sometimes overheard pieces of stories. "We had this one lecture about reading terrain like it's lying to you," or the old instructor said to track consequences, not ego. She smiled to herself and let their voices pass on. In quiet evenings, back in the mountains she now visited on leave more than lived in, she walked the slopes her uncle had once guided her through. The cabin still stood, creaking under snow in winter, smelling of pine and old gun oil in summer. Jonah was long gone, buried on a hill where the sunrise hit first, but his presence clung to the place like the smell of wood smoke. She would sit on the propped-up porch with a mug of coffee, watching the wind move treetops, and think of how strange and simple the chain had been. One man training one girl, not because a policy demanded it, but because he believed skill and responsibility should travel where they were willing to go. One girl taking that training into a world where some doors stuck and some swung open only under pressure. One valley, one bad plan, one decision to climb instead of obey. From those points, a dozen young shooters now out in the world carried ideas that had nothing to do with her name and everything to do with her choices. If anyone had asked her what the story of her life was about, she would not have said it was about proving anything in particular about women, or mountains, or even snipers. She would have said, quietly, that it was about craft and humility, about knowing something well enough that you can see when others are wrong, and caring enough to act anyway, even if you'll take heat for it later. About listening to the landscape, the patterns, the people who taught you, more than to the comfortable narratives others lean on. She had not set out to change how a commander like Elias Rourke thought. She had set out to do her job right. The change in him, and in the generations of snipers who followed, was simply the echo of that stubborn commitment, rolling down from a high ridge long after the rifle shots had faded. Adapted structurally from the reference story you shared, with all characters, details, and themes rewritten in an original way.